Good morning, class. My name is Claudia Martinez. My topic today is about strategy. I think naturally I kind of just lean towards this topic because I'm a very logical person. Usually when I'm trying to reach certain goals in my life, I try to think about, what are the steps that I need to do in order to reach my goal. So strategy was something of interest to me. And then I thought about, well, in large organizations where they put so much time and resource into strategy, I mean, you want to know where you're headed or how you're doing. So my topic is, or my question was, how to evaluate your strategy. The organization as an open system. What exactly is an open system? In the picture below, we see that we have inputs from the environment, such as raw materials, that could be money, people resources, technology, and they go into the system or into the organization. And through the strategy and structure, they transform those raw materials into products or service back to society as outputs. One important feature of organizations is to bring resources together to accomplish unified goals for that organization. Since the transformational process is largely influenced and driven by strategy, we should probably monitor it and modify it if the expected results are not achieved. If we want to monitor our strategy, how do we measure it? How do we monitor it? And really there is no simple direct way. Seymour Tillis, he was a management consultant from the 1960s. He describes establishing a strategy as like aiming at a moving target because there's just so many factors going into instead of a direct approach to answer my research question of how to evaluate a strategy, I thought a more comprehensive approach needs to be considered. I think strategy needs to be evaluated in the design process, during the implementation, and post-execution of strategy. In 1963, Seymour Tillis, he published an article, How to Evaluate Corporate Strategy. And in this article, he provided a list of criteria that a company that's rethinking of their strategy should consider in the creation of their strategy. So the first one is internal consistency. The policies of an organization, they will provide guidance as to how strategy can be implemented. So therefore, the policies and the strategy, they need to be consistent with one another. Are the policies of that organization conducive to implementing the strategy? Is the strategy consistent with the environment? As we know, the environment could be constantly changing. The organization needs to evaluate the environment currently present and in the future. How could it possibly change in the future? Availability of resources. Do we have enough resources to begin with to implement this strategy? Do we have the money? Do we have the raw materials? If we don't, where can we get them? Risk. How much risk are we willing to put in? Are we willing to put all of our resources in one basket, or are we just going to focus on one? And finally, is the strategy working? Tillis emphasizes that organizations should have some sort of measurement to know where it stands and to monitor their strategy. Moving on to the next stage, the implementation stage. I found a study where they found these organizations that were successful in implementing a strategy, and their measurements after the strategy had been implemented reflected that success. And so they looked at those organizations more closely to see what had these organizations had done to have a successful implementation. And they found 4 mechanisms that contribute to the success. Agreement, the top leadership and the operational management, they need to be in agreement with what the strategy and what the goals are. There's clarity and communication. Once the strategy is designed, it needs to be communicated to the entire organization and understood by everyone at all levels, and relevant to them, to everybody in the organization. And focus and alignment. Each unit of the organization needs to be aligned and working towards that overall strategic vision. And finally, the culture, the attitude and the behavior of that organization, how well they take in that strategy is going to impact of how it's implemented. Finally, we are in the post-execution phase. And now we are ready to measure how we are doing in our strategy. So KPI stands for Key Performance Indicators. They help a company to know if they're moving towards their desired goals. The advantage of establishing KPIs is that they can be quantifiable. One important consideration to think about when choosing what KPI an organization should have is that it should be relevant to the employee at every levels. You need to have that buy-in from them, because on these KPIs, we want to improve our KPI, those numbers that we see. And the only way that an employee will be motivated to improve is if it's relevant to them somehow. Naturally, one of the first KPIs that comes to mind when we think about measuring the success of a company is money, profit. Are we on the positive side? One of the reasons is because it's easy to count. It's a very objective. We know where we stand. But something that we want to consider is that the only measurement that we want to go by? In an article that I found called Measuring People and Performance, Closing the Gap, it suggests that organizations would not hesitate to agree with this statement. People are our most important asset, yet not every organization have people measurements. In the early 1990s, we have Robert Kaplan and David Norton, who they were looking at what other measurements can an organization use besides the financial aspect. They were inspired by the scientist Lord Kelvin, who would say, if you cannot measure it, then you cannot improve it. They were doing like a study of several organizations, and they were looking at how those organizations were measuring their strategy. And in the end, they came to a conclusion of 4 aspects that an organization should look at or should measure. One, it's learning and growth. Are the employees getting the proper training? in order to be successful and to provide back into the company. The internal processes of the organization, are they conducive into achieving better customer satisfaction? And then we have customer satisfaction itself, and finally we have the financial aspect as well. And the idea behind this, it was to create a more balanced perspective of what's going on in an organization and not just focusing on the financial aspect of it. On the previous screen, we saw the balance scoreboard as PKIs, additional PKIs to the financial aspect. We were looking at now at customer satisfaction, the internal processes, and learning and growth of the organization. The inclusion of those non-financial metrics is incredibly valuable because they are predictive indicators of future financial performance. Since when the BSC, or the Balance Scoreboard, originally came out, it has evolved from just being KPIs to a strategic management system. And the advantage to it as being a management system is that traditional management systems, they are unable to link the organization's long-term strategy to short-term actions because they revolve around short-term financial measures. Whereas the BSC, when used as a management system, it relies on 3 additional measurements. And when Kaplan and Norton was investigating, conducting their research, and they were looking at these organizations that they themselves were evolving the Balance Scoreboard into a management system, they realized that they started to see 4 new management processes that help link the long-term strategic plan to the short-term actions. And this is what we see in the diagram below. We see the Balance Scorecard, still the same thing from what we saw from the previous screen, the financial, the customer satisfaction, the internal process, and learn and growth. And from there, it branches out to this management process of translating the vision and communicating and linking to everybody in the organization. And then the business planning, we're setting the targets, those measurements. And finally, feedback and learning, evaluate where measurements are. How do we need to adjust our strategy? How can we do better? And then it goes back to translating the vision again. The Balance Scorecard, it's really a system that is not for those organizations that they only want an easy, quick fix. It's a tool meant for those organizations that are interested for a long-term strategy management system or a solution. So it is a lengthy process that really it can be taken lightly. One of the studies that I read about, it took a company about 30 months to get the BSC into place, and they had to go back and forth reevaluating the management processes, and asking, is this right for us? And finally, after 30 months, they came up with a BSC that worked for that company. But the advantage of the BSC is that it will align your actions from today to your long-term goals. And for a company, that's very important to keep your eye on the overall vision of that company. I kind of just wanted to highlight that the BSC, that as it is as a system management system that evolved in the late 1990s, early 2000s, has very similar concepts to what Seymour Tillis back in the 1960s recommended that a strategy should have. So even though that the final metrics of an organization are measured at the end after post execution of a strategy, you really want to look at the initial phase of when you're designing a strategy, during the implementation, and yes, finally at post execution, because anything in one of those phases that are not in alignment for the organization will be reflected at the end. So that's why evaluating the strategy, or how do you know that it's working for you, it's not really a direct answer. It's a process that you have to evaluate at each stage of the strategy. And finally, you do have some metric systems out there, such as the BSC, that really can help you set you for your long-term goals. This concludes my presentation. I hope that you guys were able to learn something from it and take something back to your organizations. Thank you for your time.